May 9, 1941, 12:35 hours, North Atlantic, 300 miles south of Iceland. Oberleutnant Fritz Julius Lemp clung to wreckage in water, so cold it felt like knives cutting through his skin. Around him, what remained of U-110's crew struggled in the swells. 32 men from a complement of 47. The rest still entombed in the submarine sinking beneath them. The North Atlantic was black, endless, and indifferent to their survival. Lemp had commanded U-110 for 18 months, sinking 12 Allied merchant ships totaling 68,000 tons. He'd hunted convoys from the western approaches to Gibraltar, attacked under cover of darkness, withdrawn before escorts could respond. The propaganda called it the happy time. U-boats operating with near impunity, strangling Britain's Atlantic lifeline, sending Allied sailors to cold graves with clockwork regularity. Now Lemp was the one in the water, hypothermia already setting in, watching HMS Bulldog circle the debris field like a shark. The destroyer had depth-charged U-110 to the surface, forced the emergency blow that brought them up, crippled and helpless. Lemp had ordered abandon ship before Bulldog's guns could finish them. Now his crew floated in their own oil slick, waiting for British machine guns to complete what the depth charges had started. The propaganda had been explicit. The British Royal Navy showed no mercy to U-boat crews. They would machine gun survivors in the water, revenge for all the merchant sailors who drowned when torpedoes struck without warning. Survival meant capture, meant torture, meant eventual execution. Better to drown quickly than face what the British would do. Lemp watched Bulldog approach, main guns trained on the floating Germans, and waited for the firing to begin. He'd sunk British ships. He'd killed British sailors. Now came the accounting. He closed his eyes and prayed it would be quick. A voice called across the water in German, "Grab the lines, we're pulling you aboard." Lemp opened his eyes. British sailors were throwing rope ladders and life rings over Bulldog's side. Not firing, not aiming, preparing to rescue. He stared in incomprehension as his radio man, 19-year-old Klaus Wild, grabbed a life ring and was hauled aboard. Then his engineer, then his torpedo man. British hands pulling German sailors from the sea, wrapping them in blankets, leading them to shelter. Lemp grabbed a line himself, too cold to process what was happening, hauled upward by British sailors who should have been shooting him. He collapsed on Bulldog's deck, shivering uncontrollably, unable to reconcile the propaganda about British cruelty with the reality of British sailors removing his soaked clothing and wrapping him in dry wool blankets. A British petty officer crouched beside him, speaking careful German. "You're safe now. We'll get you warm. Medical officer will check you shortly." Lemp managed to speak through chattering teeth. "Why? Why not just shoot us?" The petty officer looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Because you're in the water, mate. That's when the fighting stops." The happy time. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign of the war, had been raging since September 1939, when U-30 torpedoed the passenger liner SS Athenia on the war's first day. By spring 1941, German U-boats were winning decisively. Operating in groups called wolf packs, they'd developed tactics that devastated Allied convoys, surface at night when radar couldn't detect them, attack multiple targets simultaneously, dive before escorts could respond, reload and repeat. The mathematics were brutal. U-boats could sink merchantmen faster than Britain could replace them. Churchill would later write, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. I was even more anxious about this battle than I had been about the glorious air fight called the Battle of Britain." German submarine crews called it Die glückliche Zeit, The happy time. They hunted Allied shipping with near impunity, returned to French bases as heroes, received medals and promotions. U-boat commanders became celebrities. Propaganda films portrayed them as modern knights, clean warriors fighting honorable submarine warfare against British Empire's merchant navy. The reality was darker. U-boat attacks were often executed at night against unarmed merchantmen. Torpedoes struck without warning. Ships sank in minutes. Merchant sailors had perhaps seconds to abandon ship before frigid Atlantic water claimed them. Many drowned. Others died of hypothermia in lifeboats. Some were never found. The British knew exactly what U-boats were doing, reading decoded German communications through ultra-intelligence, tracking attacks, counting losses. Merchant sailors knew the risks every time they sailed. Convoy escorts knew they were protecting ships against enemies who struck from darkness and disappeared before retaliation was possible. This context, years of merchant sailors dying in freezing water, thousands of tons of supplies lost, Britain's survival threatened by submarine blockade, made what happened next extraordinary: the turning. By May 1941, British anti-submarine warfare was evolving from desperate reaction to systematic hunting. New technologies shifted the balance. Improved sonar that could track submerged submarines more accurately, centimetric radar that could detect surfaced U-boats at night, high-frequency direction finding, HUFDUF, that triangulated U-boat radio transmissions, depth charges with improved fusing that detonated at precise depths. More importantly, escort groups were developing tactics specifically designed to kill U-boats. Convoy escorts no longer simply defended merchantmen. They hunted submarines aggressively, pursuing sonar contacts until submarines were forced to surface or destroyed. The hunters were becoming hunted. U-110 departed Lorient on March 15, 1941, under Oberleutnant Lemp's command. The mission: patrol northwest of Cape Finisterre, intercept Gibraltar-bound convoys, sink as much tonnage as possible. Standard Wolfpack operations. For 2 months, U-110 operated successfully. 5 confirmed kills. No damage. Lemp reported to BDU, U-boat command, that British anti-submarine measures remained ineffective. Convoys were poorly defended, escorts were cautious, depth charge attacks were inaccurate. The happy time continued. On May 9th, U-110 detected convoy OB-318, approximately 40 merchantmen with weak escort. Lemp positioned for attack, fired torpedoes at 2 ships from periscope depth, prepared to dive and evade. Instead, HMS Obritia and HMS Broadway detected U-110's periscope wake, established sonar contact, and executed immediate depth charge attack. The charges detonated close enough to rupture U-110's pressure hull, knock out electrical systems, jam dive planes, and fill compartments with chlorine gas from shattered battery cells. Lemp had no choice. Surface or die trapped underwater. He ordered emergency blow, compressed air forcing water from ballast tanks, submarine rising uncontrollably to surface. U-110 broke surface at 12:30 hours, listing badly, unable to dive, dead in the water. HMS Bulldog closed immediately, guns trained, preparing to finish the crippled submarine. The surrender. What happened next violated every assumption German submarine crews held about British behavior. Bulldog's captain, Commander Joe Baker Creswell, observed U-110 through binoculars, hatches opening, crew emerging, hands raised. The submarine was clearly finished, engines dead, taking water, no longer a threat. But standing orders were explicit: destroy all enemy vessels, take prisoners only when strategically valuable. Baker Creswell made his decision in seconds. The U-boat was modern, possibly containing intelligence materials. Capturing it intact would provide immense intelligence value, codebooks, ciphers, perhaps even the Enigma machine itself. But first, secure the crew before they could scuttle properly. He gave orders that contradicted everything German propaganda predicted. Cease fire. Prepare to take prisoners. Bulldog closed to 200 meters. British sailors threw ropes and life rings. German sailors, expecting to be shot, hesitated before grabbing lines. Some were too injured or hypothermic to climb. British sailors went down rope ladders into the water, the same water where their enemies were drowning, and physically hauled Germans aboard. Radioman Klaus Wild, 19 years old and terrified, grabbed a rope and was pulled up Bulldog's side by sailors who'd lost friends to U-boat attacks. They stripped his soaked clothing, wrapped him in blankets, led him below decks where steam heating could prevent hypothermia. I kept waiting for them to beat us, Wild recalled in a 1985 interview. We'd sunk their ships, killed their sailors. I'd been told British were savages who tortured prisoners. Instead, they gave us hot tea and dry clothes. A British sailor, couldn't have been older than me, offered me a cigarette and said, "Rough day, eh?" As though we were colleagues who'd had a workplace accident rather than enemies who'd been trying to kill each other. The rescue took 20 minutes. 32 Germans pulled from the water. 15 had died in the submarine or drowned before reaching safety. The survivors sat on Bulldog's deck, shivering, wrapped in Royal Navy blankets, drinking tea from chipped enamel mugs, unable to process the disconnect between propaganda and reality. The boarding. While his crew recovered, Baker Cresswell made another calculation. U-110 was still floating, badly damaged but not yet sunk. If boarding party could reach her before she went down, intelligence materials might be recovered. He selected 8 volunteers, sailors who understood the risks. U-110 could sink at any moment. She could explode if scuttling charges were set with delayed fuses. Chlorine gas from damaged batteries could kill anyone entering. This was extremely dangerous work with uncertain rewards. The boarding party took a motor whaler across, climbed onto U-110's slippery deck, forced open hatches, and descended into the submarine. What they found changed the war. In the radio room, codebooks documenting current naval cipher settings. In the captain's cabin, sailing orders, grid charts, operational instructions. In the radio operator's station, a 3-rotor Enigma machine, still functional, ready to be recovered. The boarding party worked frantically, passing materials to the whaler, codebooks, charts, mechanical parts, anything that might have intelligence value. The submarine was settling deeper, water rising through lower compartments, the whole structure groaning from structural damage. After 30 minutes, with water reaching the control room deck plates, the boarding party evacuated with everything they could carry. 15 minutes later, U-110 finally slipped beneath the waves, taking her remaining secrets to the ocean floor. Baker Cresswell immediately imposed absolute secrecy. The captured Germans were isolated, forbidden from communicating with each other or other prisoners. They were told repeatedly that U-110 had sunk with all hands, that no capture had occurred, that their survival must never be disclosed to other Germans. The intelligence materials were rushed to Bletchley Park, where cryptanalysts used them to break current German naval Enigma settings. For months afterward, British intelligence could read U-boat communications in near real time, a decisive advantage that would help turn the Battle of the Atlantic. But the Germans never knew. BDU recorded U-110 as lost with all hands. No investigation occurred. No security procedures were changed. The Enigma compromise remained secret until after the war. The treatment. The 32 survivors from U-110 were transported to Britain, processed as prisoners of war, and sent to camps under strict security protocols. Their treatment followed standard British POW procedures: adequate food, weatherproof housing, medical care, work assignments within Geneva Convention guidelines. Nothing exceptional, just the systematic decency Britain extended to all captured enemies. For submarine crews who'd been told British would torture them, the normalcy was profoundly disorienting. Klaus Wild spent 3 years in a camp in Lancashire. We worked on farms, received regular meals, had access to medical care. Guards were professional, firm, but not cruel. We could write letters home, under censorship. We had religious services. It was imprisonment, yes, but imprisonment that followed rules. No torture, no starvation, no executions. Everything we'd been told about British brutality was propaganda. The psychological impact was significant. These men had participated in warfare that killed tens of thousands of merchant sailors. They'd sunk unarmed ships without warning. They'd left survivors in freezing water without assistance. Now they were receiving systematic care from the nation they'd tried to starve into surrender. The contradiction forced reconsideration of everything German propaganda claimed about British character. If the British weren't barbaric toward captured enemies, if they followed civilized standards even when dealing with U-boat crews, then perhaps other propaganda claims were equally false. The law of the sea. What the Germans didn't understand was that British behavior followed traditions older than any ideology, maritime customs dating back centuries that governed conduct even during war. The Royal Navy had been shaped by 300 years of experience that taught fundamental lessons. Sailors respect other sailors regardless of nationality. Enemies in combat become shipwrecked mariners once in the water. The sea itself was deadly enough without adding human cruelty. Professional naval forces maintain standards that separate them from pirates and murderers. These weren't sentimental feelings. They were professional ethics embedded in naval culture. You fought hard, but you fought honorably. You tried to kill enemies afloat, but you rescued them if they ended up in the water. That's what professional navies did. Anything less was barbarism. Commander Baker Creswell articulated this philosophy in his official report. The enemy submarine was engaged and forced to surface. Upon observing crew abandoning ship, decision was made to recover survivors per standard maritime law. 23 prisoners taken aboard, treated per King's regulations, and transferred for processing. Intelligence materials recovered from submarine before sinking. No moral grandstanding, no claims of mercy or compassion. Just matter-of-fact description of following standard procedures. That casualness, treating rescue of enemies as routine rather than exceptional, was profoundly British. The other rescues. U-110 wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the Battle of the Atlantic, British warships repeatedly rescued German submarine crews despite enormous risks. The mathematics made these rescues dangerous. Surfacing to rescue survivors meant stopping, becoming stationary target for other U-boats still operating nearby. Other submarines might interpret rescue operations as opportunity for attack. Spending time recovering German sailors meant neglecting convoy protection. Every minute spent on rescue increased risk to British ships and crews. Yet the rescues continued. Royal Navy destroyers, corvettes, and frigates pulled German sailors from the water as routine practice, not because regulations required it, but because maritime tradition demanded it. The statistics documented systematic behavior. German U-boat crews rescued by British forces, 1939-1945. Submarines sunk by British action, 525. Total German submarine personnel killed, approximately 28,000. German submariners rescued by British ships, approximately 4,200. Rescue attempts made despite tactical risk, 340 plus documented incidents. German sailors who died in British captivity, less than 50, primarily from wounds sustained before capture. Survival rate for rescued Germans, 98% plus. These weren't propaganda numbers. They were documented facts showing that British forces rescued German sailors routinely, treated them properly, and returned most of them home alive after the war. The contrast with German treatment of Allied survivors was absolute. German U-boats generally didn't rescue merchant sailors they'd torpedoed. Standing orders prohibited taking survivors aboard, except for senior officers who might provide intelligence. Allied sailors who survived torpedo attacks typically drowned in lifeboats or died of exposure. The few who reached land often did so without German assistance. The Bismarck connection. Just 18 days after U-110's capture, the same waters witnessed another dramatic rescue operation. On May 27, 1941, the battleship Bismarck, pride of the Kriegsmarine, was sunk after 3 days of pursuit. She went down with over 2,000 crew aboard. Only 114 survived, pulled from freezing water by HMS Dorsetshire and HMS Maori. The circumstances made rescue extremely risky. A U-boat had been reported in the area. Bismarck's survivors were scattered across miles of ocean. Every minute spent recovering Germans increased exposure to submarine attack. The tactical recommendation was clear: leave them and withdraw to safety. Admiral Tovey gave different orders. Recover as many as possible. The destroyers spent over an hour pulling Germans from the water. Men who'd just been shooting at British ships, who'd sunk HMS Hood with massive loss of life, who represented everything Britain was fighting against. British sailors hauled them aboard anyway, gave them blankets and medical care, treated them like shipwrecked mariners rather than hated enemies. One Bismarck survivor, Bruno Rozonka, recalled, "A British sailor pulled me aboard Dorsetshire. I was convinced they'd throw me back or shoot me. Instead, he wrapped me in a blanket, gave me hot tea, and said, 'You're safe now.' No hatred, no revenge, just professional naval rescue. That moment taught me more about British character than any propaganda could destroy." The pattern held across both incidents. Combat was fierce and professional, but once enemies ended up in the water, they were treated as mariners in distress. The British fought to kill, then rescued those they'd tried to kill. That dichotomy, absolute during combat, merciful afterward, was something German naval propaganda had never prepared crews to expect. The transformation. Extended captivity in British POW camps created ideological shifts among submarine crews who compared their treatment with Nazi claims about British brutality. The process was gradual. Initial shock at not being tortured gave way to acceptance that British followed rules even with hated enemies. This opened questions about other propaganda claims. If British weren't barbaric toward captured U-boat crews, the very crews who'd been strangling Britain's lifeline, then perhaps everything else was lies too. Klaus Wilde described his evolution. "In the camp, I had time to think. We'd sunk merchant ships, sent sailors to drown in freezing water. The British had every reason to hate us. Instead, they treated us correctly, not kindly exactly, but fairly. Guards were professional. Food was adequate. Medical care was provided. I began questioning everything I'd believed. If Nazi propaganda about British cruelty was false, what about the racial theories, the claims about Jewish conspiracy, the entire ideology I'd fought for?" This transformation wasn't universal, but it was significant. Submarine crews had been elite forces, carefully selected, highly trained. ideologically committed. Breaking their faith in Nazi ideology required overwhelming evidence. British treatment of captured submariners provided that evidence. When German U-boat veterans were repatriated after the war, many carried memories that would shape post-war German naval culture and attitudes toward Britain. They'd expected death and received rescue. They'd anticipated torture and experienced correct treatment. The disconnect between propaganda and reality had been so profound it rebuilt their understanding of what civilized naval warfare meant. The final accounting. The Battle of the Atlantic continued until May 1945, the longest campaign of the war, claiming more lives than any other naval theater. The British won, barely. By 1943, improved technology, better tactics, ultra-intelligence, and overwhelming numbers of escort vessels had turned the battle decisively against U-boats. The happy time ended. German submarines began dying faster than they could be replaced. The wolf packs were hunted to extinction. But throughout the campaign, even at darkest moments when Britain faced potential starvation, Royal Navy ships continued rescuing German submarine crews when possible. The tradition held. Professional standards were maintained. Enemies in the water became mariners in distress. Always had been, always would be. The Cold Water, North Atlantic, May 2003. Memorial service aboard HMS Bulldog, a different ship, but carrying the name. Veterans gathered. British sailors who'd served on convoy escorts. German submariners who'd survived the battle. Old men now, in their 80s, but still carrying memories of that frozen ocean where enemies became mariners, became prisoners, became eventually something approaching friends. Klaus Wild stood at the rail, looking at grey waters where he'd nearly died 62 years earlier. British sailors had pulled him from that water when letting him drown would have been easier, safer, more justified. That rescue had saved his life and rebuilt his understanding of what civilized behavior meant. A British veteran, former crew member from HMS Bulldog, stood beside him. They'd met decades earlier at a reunion, discovered their shared history, maintained correspondence ever since. "Still cold, isn't it?" the British veteran said quietly. Wild nodded. "Always cold. But I remember British hands pulling me out. Remember tea afterward. Remember thinking everything I'd been told was lies." "You lot fought hard," the British veteran replied. "Made life hell for merchant convoys. Lot of good men died because of U-boats." "I know. I'm sorry. Not your fault. You were following orders, same as us. We were just doing our jobs. You tried to sink merchants. We tried to sink you. When you ended up in the water, that's when different rules applied. Maritime law, older than any war." They stood in silence, watching waves that looked exactly like they had in 1941. Cold, grey, endless, indifferent to human conflicts. The British had pulled them from the sea. That simple act, repeated thousands of times across 6 years of warfare, had proven stronger than any propaganda, more lasting than any ideology. It remained, decades later, the story that mattered, that even in total war, some standards held, that enemies in the water became mariners in distress, that civilization meant maintaining humanity even when it would have been easier, safer, more justified to simply let them drown. The Royal Navy had fought hard, but it had also rescued those it fought against. That combination, absolute in combat, merciful in victory, was the tradition that defined professional naval service. The Germans had learned it the hard way, pulled from freezing water by hands that should have let them die, but didn't. And they'd carried that lesson home, where it helped build new Germany that understood what civilization actually meant.